First story for the evening: The Liverpool Mystery. A foreign title is always very useful for purposes of swindles and frauds. Knocked the man in the corner to me one day. The cleverest robberies of modern times were perpetrated lately in Vienna by a man who dubbed himself Lord Seymour. Whilst over here the same class of thief calls himself Count something ending in O, or Prince of the other ending in off. Fortunately for our hotel and lodging keepers over here, I replied, they're beginning to be more alive in the ways of foreign swindlers and look upon the titled gentry who speak broken English as possible swindlers or thieves. The result sometimes being exceedingly unpleasant to the real grand seigneurs, who honor this country at times of the visits, replied the man in the corner. Now, take the case of Prince Simonozik, a man whose 16 quarterlings are duly recorded at Gotha, who carried enough luggage with him to pay for the use of every room in the hotel for at least a week, whose gold cigarette case, diamond and turquoise ornaments, was actually stolen without him taking the slightest trouble to trying to recover it. The same man was undoubtedly looked upon with suspicion by the manager of the Liverpool Northwestern Hotel from the moment that his secretary, a dapper, somewhat vulgar little Frenchman, bespoke on behalf of his employer with himself and a valet the best suite of rooms the hotel contained. Obviously, from those suspicions were unfounded, for little secretary, as soon as Prince Semyones had arrived, deposited with the manager a pile of banknotes, also papers and bonds, the value of which would exceed tenfold the most outrageous bill that could possibly be placed before a noble visitor. Moreover, M. Albert Lambert explained that the prince, who only meant to stay in Liverpool for a few days, on his way to Chicago, where he wished to visit Princess Anna Simoniet, his sister, who was married to Mr. Gurwan, the great copper king and multimillionaire. Yes, as I told you before, in spite of all the undoubted sincerities, suspicion of the wealthy Russian prince lurked in the minds of most Liverpudlians who became in business contact with him. He had been in the Northwestern for 2 days when he sent his secretary to Winslow and Vassall, the jewelers of Bold Street, with a request that they would kindly send a representative round to the hotel with some nice pieces of jewelry, diamonds and pearls chiefly, which he was desirous in taking as a present to his sister in Chicago. Mr. Winslow took an answer from M. Albert with a pleasant bow. Then he went to his inner office and consulted with his partner, Mr. Vassall, as to the best course to adopt. Both the gentlemen were desirous of doing business, for business had been very slack lately. Neither wished to refuse a possible customer, or to offend Mr. Pettit, the manager of the Northwestern, who had recommended them to the prince. But that foreign title and the vulgar little French secretary stuck in the throats of the two pompous and worthy Liverpool jewelers, and together they agreed, firstly, that no credit should be given, and secondly, that if a check or even a banker's draft were tendered, the jewels were not to be given up until that check was cashed and cleared. Then came the question as to who should take the jewels to the hotel. It was altogether against business etiquette for the senior partners to do such errands themselves. Moreover, it was thought that it would be easier for the clerk to explain without giving undue offense that he could not take the responsibility of a check or draft without having cashed it previously to giving up the jewels. Then there was the question of the probable necessity of conferring in a foreign tongue. The head assistant, Charles Needham, who had been the employee of Winslow and Vassall for over 12 years, was, in true British fashion, ignorant of any language save his own. It was therefore decided to dispatch Mr. Schwartz, a young German clerk lately arrived. Mr. Schwartz was Mr. Winslow's nephew and godson, a sister of that gentleman having married the head of the great German firm of Schwartz and Co. silversmiths, of Hamburg and Berlin. The young man had soon become a great favorite with his uncle, whose heir he would presumably be, as Mr. Winslow had no children of his own. At first, Mr. Vassall made some demur about sending Mr. Schwartz with so many valuable jewels alone in a city which he had not yet had the time to study thoroughly. But finally he allowed himself to be persuaded by his senior partner, and a fine selection of necklaces, bracelets, pendants, and rings, amounting in value over to £16,000, having been made, it was decided that Mr. Schwartz should go to the Northwestern in a cab the day after, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This he accordingly did, the following day being a Thursday. Business went on in the shop as usual under the direction of the head assistant, until about 5 o'clock. Mr. Winslow returned from his club, where he usually spent an hour over the papers every afternoon, and asked for his nephew. To his astonishment, Mr. Needham informed him that Mr. Schwartz had not yet returned. This seemed a little strange, and Mr. Winslow, with a slightly anxious look in his face, went in to consult his junior partner. Mr. Vassall offered to go round to the hotel and interview Mr. Pettit. "I was beginning to get anxious myself," he said, but he did not quite like to say so. "I have been in over half an hour, hoping every moment that you would come in, and that perhaps you could give me some reassuring news. I thought that perhaps you had met Mr. Schwartz and were coming back together." However, Mr. Vassall walked around the hotel and interviewed the hall porter, and later perfectly remembered Mr. Schwartz sending in his card to Prince Simeonic. "What time was that?" asked Mr. Vassall. "About 10 minutes past 3, sir, when he came. It was about an hour later when he left." "When he left?" gasped the more said Mr. Vassall. "Yes, sir, Mr. Schwartz left here about 4:15. "Are you quite sure?" "Oh, yes, sir. Mr. Pettit was in the hall when he left and asked him something about business. Mr. Schwartz laughed and said, 'Not bad.' 'I hope there's nothing wrong, sir,' added the man. "Oh, nothing wrong, thank you. Can I see Mr. Pettit?" "Certainly, sir." Mr. Pettit, the manager of the hotel, shared Mr. Vassall's anxiety immediately when he heard that the young German had not yet returned home. "I spoke to him a little before 4 o'clock. We had just switched on the electric light, which we always do in these winter months, at that hour. But I shouldn't worry myself, Mr. Vassall. The young man may have seen some business on his way home. You'll probably find him in when you get back." Apparently, somewhat reassured, Mr. Vassall thanked Mr. Pettit and hurried back to the shop, only to find that Mr. Schwartz had not returned, though it was now close to 8 o'clock. Mr. Winslow looked so haggard and upset that it would have been cruel to heap reproaches upon his other troubles, or to utter so as the faintest suspicion that young Schwartz's permanent disappearance with £16,000 in jewels and money was within the bounds of probability. There was one chance left, but under the circumstances a very slight one indeed. The Winslow's private house was up in Birkenhead, under town. Young Schwartz had been living with him ever since his arrival at Liverpool, and he may have, either not feeling well or for some other reason, gone straight home without calling the shop. It was unlikely his valuable jewelry was never kept in a private house, but it might have happened. "It would be useless," continued the man in the corner, "and decidedly uninteresting were I to relate to you Messrs. Winslow and Vassall's further anxieties with regard to the missing young man. Suffice it to say that on reaching the private house, Mr. Winslow found that his godson had neither returned nor sent any telegraphic message of any kind." Not wishing to needlessly alarm his wife, Mr. Winslow made an attempt at eating his dinner, but directly after he hurried back to the Northwestern Hotel and asked to see Prince Semyonis. The prince was at the theater with the secretary and probably would not be home until nearly midnight. Mr. Winslow then, not knowing what to think, nor yet what to fear, and in spite of the horror he felt at giving publicity to the nephew's disappearance, thought it was his duty to go around to the police station and interview the inspector. It was wonderful how news of that type travels in a large city like Liverpool. Already the morning papers of the following day were full of the latest sensation: mysterious appearance of well-known tradesmen. Mr. Winslow found a copy of the paper containing the sensational announcement on his breakfast table. It lay side by side with a letter addressed to him in his nephew's handwriting, which had been posted in Liverpool. Mr. Winslow placed the letter, written to him by his nephew, into the hands of the police. Its contents, therefore, quickly became public property. The astounding statements made therein by Mr. Schwartz created, in quiet, business-like Liverpool, a sensation which has seldom been equaled. It appears that the young fellow did call on Prince Semyonis at 3:15 on Wednesday, December, a bag full of jewels amounting to the value of some £16,000. The prince duly admired and finally selected from among the ornaments a necklace, pendant, and bracelet, and the whole price by Mr. Schwartz according to his instructions, at £10,500. Prince Semyonis was most prompt and businesslike in his dealings. "You will require immediate payment for these, of course," he said in perfect English, "and I know you businessmen prefer solid cash to checks, especially when dealing with foreigners. I always provide myself with plenty of Bank of England notes in consequence," he added with a pleasant smile, "as £10,500 in gold would be a little inconvenient to carry. If you will kindly take out the receipts of my secretary, Mr. Lambert, and settle all business affairs with you." He thereupon took the jewels he had selected and locked them up in his dressing case, the beautiful silver fittings of which Mr. Schwartz just caught a short glimpse of. Then, having been accommodated with paper and ink, the young jeweler made out the account and receipt, whilst M. Lambert, the secretary, counted out before him 105 crisp Bank of England notes of £100 each. Then, with a final bow to his exceedingly urbane and eminently satisfactory customer, Mr. Schwartz took his leave. In the hall he spoke to Mr. Pettit, and then he went out into the street. He had just left the hotel and was about to cross towards St. George's Hall when a gentleman in a magnificent fur coat stepped quickly out of a cab which he had been stationed near the curb, and touching him lightly upon his shoulder, said with an unmistakable air of authority, at the same time handing him a card, "That is my name. I must speak to you immediately." Schwartz glanced at the card, and by the light of the arc lamps above, his head read on the name of it, "Dmitri Slavinovsky Burgrinov, de la Ilie, Section Police Imperial de S.M. Lesar." Quickly, the owner of the unpronounceable name and the significant titles pointed to the cab from which he had just alighted, and Schwartz, whose very suspicion with regard to the princely customer bristled up in one moment, clutched his bag and followed his imposing interlocutor. As soon as they were both comfortably seated in the cab, the latter began on a courteous apology in broken but fluent English. "I must beg your pardon, sir, for the trespassing upon your valuable time, and I certainly should not have done so but for the certainty that our interests in this certain matter, which I have in hand, are practically identical, insofar as we both should wish to outwit a clever rogue." Instinctively, his mind full of terrible apprehension, Mr. Schwartz's hand wandered into his pocketbook, filled to overflowing with the banknotes which he had so lately received from the prince.
I see.
I see, interposed the courteous Russian with a smile.
He has played the confidence with the usual addition of so many so-called banknotes.
So cold, gasped the unfortunate young man.
I don't often think I often err in my estimate of my own countrymen,
continued M. Berganev.
I have vast experience, you must remember. Therefore, I doubt if I am doing, what does he call himself? Prince something. So an injustice if I assist, even without handling those crisp bits of paper you have in your pocketbook, that no bank in the world would exchange them for gold.
Remembering his uncle's suspicion on his own, Mr. Schwartz cursed himself in his blindness and folly for accepting notes so easily for a moment without imagining that they might be false. Now, with everyone out of suspicion fully on the alert, he felt bits of paper with nervous, anxious laughter, while the imperturbable Russian calmly struck a match.
See here,
he said, pointing to one of the notes.
The shape of that W in the signature of the chief cashier. I'm not an English police officer, but I would pick out the spurious W among thousands of genuine ones. You see, I have seen a good many.
Now, of course, poor young Schwartz had not seen very many Bank of England notes. He could neither have told whether one W of Mr. Brown's signature from better than another. But though he did not speak English nearly as fluently as his pompous interlocutor, he understood every word of the appalling statements that the latter had made.
And that prince, he said, at the hotel. He's no more a prince than you and I, my dear sir.
Concluded the gentleman in his Imperial Majesty's police calmly.
And the jewels, Mr. Winslow's jewels. With the jewels there may be a chance. Oh, a mere chance. Those forged banknotes which you accepted so trustingly may prove the means of recovering your property.
How?
The penalty of forging and circulating spurious banknotes is very heavy. You know that. The fear of 7 years' penal servitude will act as a wonderful sedative upon the prince's joyful mood. He will give up the jewels to me right enough. Never you fear, he knows,
added the Russian officer grimly.
There are plenty of old sores to schedule up. Without the additional one of forged banknotes, our interests, you see, are identical. May I rely on your cooperation?
Oh, I will do as you wish, said the young, delighted German.
Mr. Winslow and Mr. Vassal, they trusted me, and I have been such a fool. I hope it is not too late.
I think not, said M. Bergenroff, his hand already on the door of the cab.
Oh, I have been talking to you. I have kept an eye on the hotel, and our friend the prince has not yet gone out. We are accustomed, you know, to have eyes everywhere, we of the Russian secret police. I don't think that I will ask you to be present at the confrontation. Perhaps you will wait for me in the cab. There is a nasty fog outside, and you will be more private. Will you give me those beautiful banknotes? Thank you. Don't be anxious. I will.
He lifted his hat and slipped the notes into his inner pocket of his magnificent fur coat. As he did so, Mr. Schwartz caught sight of the rich uniform and the wide sash, which no doubt was destined to carry additional moral weight with the clever rogue upstairs. Then the Imperial Majesty's police officer stepped quickly out of the cab, and Mr. Schwartz was left alone.
Part 3.
Yes, left severely alone, continued the man in the corner with a sarcastic chuckle. So severely alone, in fact, that 1/4 of an hour passed by, and still the magnificent officer in the gorgeous uniform did not return. Then, when it was too late, Schwartz cursed himself once again for the double-dyed idiot that he was. He had already only too ready to believe that the Prince Semyonis was a liar and a rogue, and under the usual unjust suspicions, he had fallen an all too easy prey to one of the most cunning rascals he had ever come across. An inquiry from the hall porter of the Northwestern elicited the fact that no such personage as Mr. Schwartz described had entered the hotel. The young man asked to see the Prince Semyonis, and against all hope that was not yet lost. The prince received him courteously. He was dictating some letters to his secretary, while the valet was in the next room preparing his master's evening clothes. Mr. Schwartz found it very difficult to explain what he exactly did want. There stood a dressing case in which the prince had locked up the jewels, and there was a bag from which the secretary had taken the banknotes. After much hesitation on Schwartz's part, and much impatience on that of the prince, the young man blurted out the whole story of the so-called Russian police officer whose card he still held in his hand. The prince, it appears, took the whole thing wonderfully good-natured. No doubt he thought the jeweler a hopeless fool. He showed him the jewels and the receipts he held, and also a large bundle of banknotes similar to those Schwartz had just such capacity given to the clever rascal in the cap. I pay all my bills with Bank of England notes, Mr. Schwartz. It would have been wiser, perhaps, if you had spoken to the manager of the hotel about me before you were so ready to believe any cock and bull story of my supposed rogueries. Finally, he placed a small, thin-mouthed volume before the young jeweler and said with a pleasant smile, "If people in this country who are in large way of business, and therefore likely to come into contact with people of foreign nationality, were to study these little volumes before doing business with any foreigner who claims the title, much disappointment and a great loss would often be saved. Now, in this case, had you looked up page 797 of this little volume of Gotha's Almanac, you would have seen my name in it, and known from the first that the so-called Russian detective was a liar." There was nothing more to be said, and Mr. Schwartz left the hotel. No doubt, now that he had been hopelessly duped, he dared not go home, and half hoped at communicating with the police that they might succeed in arresting the thief before he had the time to leave Liverpool. He interviewed Detective Inspector Watson, and was at once confronted with the awful difficulty which would make the recovery of the banknotes practically hopeless. He had never had the time or opportunity of jotting down the numbers of the banknotes. Mr. Winslow, though terribly wrathful against his nephew, did not wish to keep him out of his home. As soon as he had received Schwartz's letter, he traced him, with Inspector Watson's help, to his lodgings in North Street, where the unfortunate young man meant to remain hidden until the terrible storm had blown over, or perhaps until the thief had been caught red-handed, with the booty still in his hands. This happy event, needless to say, never did occur, though the police made every effort to trace the man who had decoyed Schwartz into the cab. His appearance was such an uncommon one, it seemed most likely that no one in Liverpool would have noticed him after he left that cab. The wonderful fur coat, the long beard, all must have been noticeable, even though it had been 4 in the morning and somewhat foggy December afternoon. But every investigation proved futile. No one answering Schwartz's description of the man had been seen anywhere. The papers continued to refer to the case as a Liverpool mystery. Scotland Yard sent Mr. Fairburn down, the celebrated detective, at the request of the Liverpool police to help in the investigation, but nothing availed. Prince Semyonis, in his suite, left Liverpool, and he who had attempted to blacken his character and had succeeded in robbing Messrs. Winslow and Vassell £10,500, had completely disappeared.
Part 4. The man in the corner readjusted his collar and necktie, which, during the narrative of this interesting mystery, had worked its way up his long, crane-like neck under large, flappy ears. His costume of checked tweed of a particularly loud pattern had trickled down some fancy of the waitress who were standing gazing at him and giggling in the corner. This evidently made him nervous. He gazed up at me very meekly, looking for all the world like a bald-headed adjudicant dressed for the holiday.
Of course, at first all sorts of theories were fluffed about. One of the most popular, and at the same time most quickly exploded, being that young Schwartz had told a cock and bull story, and there was the actual thief himself. However, as I said before, that it was very quickly exploded, as Mr. Schwartz, Sr., a very wealthy merchant, never allowed his son's carelessness to be a serious loss to his kind employers. As soon as he thoroughly grasped the circumstances of the extraordinary case, he drew a check for £10,500 and remitted it to Mrs. Winslow and Vassall. It was just, but it was also high-minded. All Liverpool knew about the generous action of Mr. Winslow took care that it should. Any evil suspicion regarding young Mr. Schwartz vanished as quickly as it had come. Then, of course, there was the theory about the prince and his suite. And to this day, I fancy there are plenty of people at Liverpool, and also in London, who declare that the so-called Russian officer was a Confederate. No doubt the theory was very plausible, and Mrs. Winslow and Vassall spent a good deal of money trying to prove a case against the Russian prince. Very soon, however, that theory also was bound to collapse. Mr. Fairburn, whose reputation as an investigator of crimes waxes in the direction inverted ratio to his capacities, did he hit upon the obvious course of interviewing the managers for large London and Liverpool agents to change. He soon found that Prince Semyonis had converted a great deal of Russian and French money into English banknotes since his arrival in the country a few days ago. More than £30,000 in solid, good, honest money had traced the pockets of the gentleman with 16 quarterings. It seems, therefore, more than improbable that the man who is obviously fairly wealthy would risk imprisonment and hard labor, if not worse, for the sake of increasing his fortune by £10,000. However, the theory of the prince's guilt was taken firm root in the dull minds of our police authorities. They have had every information with regard to Prince Semyonis's innocence from Russia. His position, his wealth, have placed above suspicion, and yet they suspect and go on suspecting him and his secretary. They have communicated with the police in every European capital, and while they still hope to remain sufficient evidence against those who they suspect, they calmly allow for the guilty to enjoy the fruit of this clever roguery. The guilty? I said. Who do you think? Who do I think knew at the moment that young Schwartz has the money in his possession? He said exaggerately, wiggling in his chair like a jack-in-the-box. Obviously, someone was guilty of that theft who knew that Schwartz had gone to interview the rich Russian, and would in all probability return with a large sum of money in his possession. Oh, indeed, but the prince and his secretary, I argued. But just now you said... Just now I said that the police were determined that the prince and his secretary were guilty. They did not look further than their own stumpy noses. Mrs. Winslow and Vassall spent money with a free hand in those investigations. Mr. Winslow, as a senior partner, stood to lose over £9,000 by that robbery. Now with Mrs. Vassall, it was different. When I saw how the police went blundering in the case, I took the trouble to make certain inquiries, and the whole thing interested me so much that I learned all that I wished to know. I found out, namely, that Mr. Vassall was very much a junior partner in the firm, that he only drew 10% of the profits, having been promoted lately to a partnership from having been senior assistant. Now the police did not take trouble to IQ to find that out. But you don't mean that? I mean that in all cases where robbery affects more than one person, the first thing to find out is whether it affects a second party equally with the first. I proved that to you, didn't I, over the robber of the Fillmore Terrace? There, as here, one of the two parties stood to lose little in comparison with the other. Even then, I began. Wait a moment, for I found out something more. The moment that I ascertained that Master Russell was not drawing more than £500 a year from the business profits, I tried to ascertain at what rate he lived and what were his chief vices. I found that he kept a fine house in Albert Terrace. Now, the rent of those houses is £250 a year. Therefore, speculation, horse racing, or some sort of gambling must help keep his establishment. Speculation and most forms of gambling are synonymous with debt and ruin. It is only a question of time. Whether Mr. Vassall was in debt or not at the time, that I cannot say. But this I do know, that ever since that unfortunate loss to him of about £1,000, he has kept his house in a nicer style than before, and now has a good banking account at the Lancashire and Liverpool Bank, which he opened a year after his heavy loss. But it must have been very difficult, Harriet. What? He said. To have planned out the whole thing, for carrying it out was mere child's play. He had 24 hours in which to put his plan into execution. Why, what was it to do? Firstly, to go to a local printer and get some part of the way to get him some 3 rounds of cards with a high-sounding name. That, of course, is done while you wait. Beyond that, there was the purchase of a good second-hand uniform, fur coat, and a beard or wigs from the customers. No, the execution was not difficult. It was the planning of it all, the daring that was so fine. Schwartz, of course, was a foreigner. He had only been in England a little time, for a fortnight. Vassall's broken English misled him. Probably he did not know the junior's partner intimately. I have no doubt that, but for his uncle's absurd British prejudice and suspicions against Russian prince, Schwartz would have not been so ready to believe the latter's roguery. As I said, it would be a great boon if English tradesmen studied Gotha, but it was a clever, wasn't it? I couldn't have done it much better myself. The last sentence was so characteristic, I wished I could render its supreme, overwhelming self-conceit. Before I could think of some plausible argument against his theory, he was gone, and I was trying vainly to find another solution.